Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for coming. For those who don't know me, I'm Alistair Burt. I'm the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Health and Medical Sciences. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Kaurna people, the original custodians of the Adelaide Plains and the land on which the university's premises here on North Terrace, Theberton, Roseworthy and Waite are built. So I'm really pleased to see so many of you here this evening. This is part of a series of lectures that we have, we call the Executive Dean's Lecture Series. They are very much around topics that we hope to be of general interest to staff, but also, and most importantly, to general public. Today we're doing something slightly different. We've got it by way of a debate. Normally it is a single speaker on a topic, but tonight we're going to be considering the topic of diet for good health. And that can be quite complex, it can be quite confusing in the literature, in the media. So we thought what we'd do tonight would be to have you hear about two interpretations, two approaches, using an evidence base, first from Pennie Taylor, and then from Dr. Alphonse and Heleen Roux. And the proceedings will be overseen by Professor Maria Macready, who's going to see fair play. So Pennie Taylor is a senior research dietitian at CSIRO Health and Biosecurity, and she's co-author of the CSIRO Low-carb Diet Plan. She's a director and principal dietitian of Evolme, a multidisciplinary weight loss clinic. She's managed and supported clinical research trials exploring the influence of dietary patterns and composition on health outcomes. Presenting a somewhat alternative view is husband and wife team Dr. Alphonse and Heleen Roux. Both became fascinated by the abundance of studies that indicate that a plant-based lifestyle may be preventative for a number of chronic diseases. Heleen, by the way, is the first Australian to be certified in plant-based nutrition from the Food for Life programme. So as I said, facilitating the debate this evening is Professor Maria Macready. Maria is the theme lead for Healthy Mothers, Babies and Children at the South Australian Health and Medical Research Institute. She's also director of the Child Nutrition Research Centre and a professor of human nutrition here at the University of Adelaide. So to begin tonight's the diet debate, eating your way to a healthy lifestyle, I'm pleased to welcome and introduce Professor Maria Macready.
Thank you very much. It's my great pleasure to be here to ensure that we have a great discussion, and so that we don't keep you from your dinner, we will make sure that we stick strictly to time. The order of proceedings is that Pennie will first present for 15 minutes on the low-carbohydrate diet perspective, followed by another 15 minutes by Heleen and Alphonse. Then we'll have 15 minutes of question and answers, and each team will have the opportunity to have a 3-minute summary to capture anything that they feel needs to come from the questions or discussions, and I get to make the closing remarks and have the last word, which is pretty exciting and it doesn't usually happen. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce Pennie Taylor, who will talk about the low-carbohydrate diets in perspective, and at 5 minutes we'll hold up a 5-minute sign, and at 1 minute the 1-minute sign.
Definitely going to need that for me. Thank you everybody, and thank you to all the staff from Adelaide University and everybody that's attended tonight. I hope you get a lot out of tonight. So I'm going to talk about low-carb diets in perspective, and first I need to work out the right direction. So on the menu tonight for me, I want to talk about the dietary guidelines and put it in perspective before we talk about low carbs. And then I want to go into defining low-carb diets and look at the core characteristics of a low-carb diet. And I've got a couple of little sneaky points around the dietary composition and what that provides as far as nutritional sufficiency as well. So is what you're eating, is it providing you enough nutrients for good balance of health? But first of all, I just want you to stop and think. So have you all seen that movie, What's Your Number? Put your hands up, dob yourself in. So most people might not know what I'm talking about here. Emma Stone in the middle is that facial expression about having a number. So I've got this up here just to represent that when you talk in health circles around low-carbohydrate diets, that's the expression I tend to get. It's almost like, oh, what are you doing? You're having low-carb? And it really comes with the presumption that low-carb diets restrict bread, cereal, rice, pasta, and all you're eating is meat, chicken, fish. So I really want to put that into perspective tonight. And so first to get me started is really the perspective of our current dietary guidelines. And if you're familiar with the dietary guidelines, they're Australian-based for us, and they're on this website for NRV's Chronic Disease Summary. And really what they say for the general healthy population, to prevent chronic disease risk, we need to be eating a protein intake of between 15 to 25% of protein, total grams, and carbohydrates 45 to 65% and total fat. So we're talking nutrients there. And outside of these ranges can be an increased risk of chronic disease. So these are the guidelines that we need to abide by. So they're very broad. The guidelines go on to say, you know, for eat for health, we also need to maintain healthy weight, to be physically active, choose amounts. And these are terms that you probably already know. Enjoy a wide variety of foods. So what I'm going to do is show you how low carbohydrate diets can still fit within that area. So when we talk about the dietary guidelines as such, one thing we forget to look at is what are Australians currently eating. So we have these guidelines: protein, carbohydrates, total fat. All the foods that you choose need to provide a range of these macronutrients. You need to be active and healthy to prevent chronic disease. So Australians, are we eating enough? And this is basically the food supply data evaluation from the state government. So this is health survey data that we look at, and we look at what the consumption patterns are across Australia. It has changed somewhat, and the average carbohydrate intake, or the mean carbohydrate intake of the adult population over 80 to about 75, are looking at about 45% of their total energy intake coming from carbohydrates. So we are within that range. Going back. Protein, definitely getting, it's not as high as we, I guess, going back to the protein, 15 to 25, it's looking quite good at 18, and total fat is 31%, and saturated fat is about 12% or 9 grams in the average person's intake. And looking at that, you go, well, you're pretty close. We're close to the dietary guidelines, so what's wrong? Why have we got a fat nation, basically? And then you look at that red line there. 70% of the carbohydrate intake in our population has come from refined sugars. And so what I'm going to express today is just talk about, you know, looking at those dietary patterns, looking at how we actually consume our foods within Australia, and even though we are getting better and we're actually eating less carbohydrates, we're eating less, we're still eating more refined carbohydrates. So it's not just about the macros, it's about the composition and what makes up that food. So are lower carbohydrate diets overrated or understated? Should I get a vote of hands? Who's for low carbohydrate diets? Okay, who's not sure? I'm not going to go say against, I'm not sure. Beautiful. Gives me something to work with, thank you. So are they overrated or understated? So first thing we've got to know is, what is a low carbohydrate diet? What is a lower carbohydrate diet? And this is one of the biggest dilemmas when we talk about it. No one really wants to talk about the number. And that goes back to my first slide. You get that shock and awe because the low carb diet always brings across that connotation that you're just cutting out certain food groups and you're restricting or having no carbohydrates. Whereas in fact, there's a whole range, there's a continuum of what is a lower carbohydrate diet. And this paper, if you're in nutrition or areas of medicine and you want to know a little bit more about the definition of low carbohydrate diets, this paper by Richard Feynman actually summarised it really quite nicely. So we have a range of different lower carbohydrate diets. So a very low carbohydrate diet is called the ketogenic diet. So you would have heard that maybe 20 grams or less of carbohydrates. Now research in this area has shown that ketogenic diets are actually quite popular in managing epilepsy in children. And there's a bit of research around that. And then we got the low carbohydrate and the moderate carbohydrate, and that's where I work, within the range of that continuum between 50 grams to 130 grams. And then we have what we call the higher carbohydrate diet, such as the guidelines, anything that's exceeding about 230 grams a day to 45% of total energy. Now, we are focusing at carbohydrates, but you can see in that little blue box there, we do consider protein, and for those who want to know, protein between 1 to 1.5 grams a kilogram per body weight is considered quite okay, and the rest of healthy fats. So just in the picture, that this is the carb continuum. So when somebody talks to you about a low carbohydrate diet, ask them what is their number. Ask them how do they get to that number and what foods they consume, because you'll be quite surprised. A lot of people, when they talk about carbohydrates, notoriously will say I'm on a low carbohydrate, but get fruit and vegetables and forget that, you know, your dairy and even nuts can actually contribute to your carbohydrate load within your diet. People, when you talk carbohydrate, immediately think breads, cereals, rice and pasta, and that's not the case. So when you talk to somebody, ask them a little bit more about their foods and how they could actually be contributing to their dietary pattern healthily, and rather than just restricting sugar and breads and cereals. Now, what we found in practice and in some of our research that we've done with the clinical trials that underpin the current CSIRO diet, low-carb diet, is we found that 50 to up to 70 grams and even 90 grams found positive health outcomes under supervision. So it was a controlled trial that we did for about 2 years. And we did find that, you know, our lower carbohydrate diet of 50 grams in the diabetic population did have a positive outcome on reducing HbA1c and medications, but the weight change was the same. And that's where most people also go to low-carb diets, is for weight loss. And when we talk about weight loss, it's a completely different story. So are low-carb and high healthy fats, what is the evidence? And so what I present here today is a summary of a couple of RCTs. So people that aren't in the research area, randomised control trials are considered to be the gold standard. And we look at 1 or 2 randomised control trials, and they're quite good evidence-based, but you're better when you get a group of the control trials that have been done really quite rigorously, and that becomes a systematic review or up to a meta-analysis. So these terms that you might hear are actually terms that we look at to find out whether these diets are safe and effective. So looking at these outcomes from a couple of randomised control trials, we did find that a lower carbohydrate versus a higher carbohydrate diet, just think back to the slides that I showed you, had comparable weight loss. We did see a greater reduction in triglycerides, which is a fatty acid found in the blood. So if you ever go to the doctor and you've got cholesterol issues, they tend to take a lipid study profile, and they'll find that you've got LDL, HDL. Triglycerides is one of those fatty profiles within the blood, which is quite sensitive to carbohydrate intake. So as soon as you start to restrict it, you actually start to see that reduce as well. Restrict carbohydrates, you see that reduce. But the benefit as well, we did see a greater increase of HDL cholesterol. Now, helper cholesterol, HDL, high lipoprotein. This is a cholesterol that is good in the blood, so it helps excrete the bad cholesterol and lowers the cholesterol overall risk. And we did see that that did improve. But we also saw similar reductions in blood pressure, insulin resistance, glucose management and inflammation markers between the both diets. So they both had positive effects for that. So put it in perspective, yes, low carbohydrate diets did have a positive effect on what we call metabolic outcomes, so triglycerides and HDL, but weight management was the same, and it was also the same for blood pressure and insulin resistance. So this is the further study. So anybody that's really interested in research, it just summarises, you know, when we look at type 2 diabetes, there's a bit of controversy around, do we use low-carb diets for treatment of diabetes? Again, think of the number and then think of what you're eating and what foods make up that diet. And these papers basically shown that with a lower carbohydrate diet, diabetics did get greater glycemic control. But that range of carbohydrate was, again, between 50 to about 130 grams. Now, 130 grams of carbohydrate a day, now I can't off the top of my head think how many pieces of bread that might be, but it's not a bad intake if you like carbohydrates, let's put it that way. And it did show a 1% reduction of relative risk in HbA1c, which is a marker of 5 minutes, a marker of glycemic control. So when we do see that risk, it's actually a really positive outcome. 1% doesn't look like much, but it's quite a magnificent change. So low carb and healthy high fats. Most of you, when you're talking about carbs, what about fats? The low carb diet that we looked at for the CSIRO, we actually promoted high healthy fats. So we didn't say low carb high fats, we said low carb high healthy fats. So your monounsaturated fats such as your olive oil, your avocado. Now the benefit of this really, we didn't see any change in lipid profile, so we didn't see any detrimental outcomes from cholesterol. It was actually quite well controlled. But what we did see is greater satiety, so people felt fuller for longer because gastric digestion changed when you increase your good saturated fats and your protein, which are natural appetite suppressants almost. Now this, I'm expecting you all to be able to read this, really to show the difference between traditional foods at a 55 gram carbohydrate daily intake, and then I removed dairy and animal foods. So here's for the vegan side of things as well, just to show you that despite me saying it's a low carbohydrate diet, we can have a low carbohydrate diet that has a vegan underpinning to it as well. So it's basically coming down to choosing your whole foods, healthy foods that aren't highly processed. So we do have that common message through the thread. So once we removed the dairy and animal foods, and that's the only thing that I really changed in this profile, this is the energy balance, just to show you that I've matched the diets as well. So we matched the total energy for 7,400 kilojoules, thereabouts. Total protein in the lower carb diet, because we can use more of the animal sources, we got the 135 grams of total protein, about 32%. But still, in the vegan, we were able to get 91 grams, which is 22%, still pretty reasonable. I won't go into the protein and the effects of protein and metabolism, but just to say that animal protein is said to have a greater appetite suppressant and actually greater muscle retention. So I'll handball that one after to the great debaters. And then we have the saturated fat, which is a lot lower in the vegan diet, as you can see there. But the total carb is pretty much 11 to 13%, and fibre, you can see the vegan diet is a lot higher, but still the low carb diet, which gets bagged for not having a lot of fibre in it, still meets the guidelines of between 20 to 30 grams a day, so that's 35 grams a day. Nutritional sufficiency, and I'm nearly done. This just shows you the traditional foods. So when we analyse food or food profiles, we actually look at each individual food and then nutrient provision from an external view, not how it digests or how it's absorbed. So these foods in the low-carb diet is nutritionally complete, so there's limited red there. And when you actually take out the animal products in the low-carb diet, you do become greater risk of B12. Selenium and iodine, they're a little bit lower in the removal of animal products, but they can be increased by adding iodized salt, for example, which isn't a detriment to the health, detriment in this if it's used in controlled portions. Iron is quite okay. Quite often you hear with vegan diets there's a lack of iron within the dietary intake, but you can see you can actually get quite a nice picture of iron consumption, but B12 is, you do have a greater risk of deficiencies in that area. So my key points: lower carb, healthy fat diets are nutritionally complete and can be vegan, so I kind of like bridge that gap. 50 to 130, remember the number and remember the types of food that contribute to that number. Again, we're looking at whole foods, less processed foods, and they did have favourable effects on lipid profile, glycemic control, so for type 2 diabetics. Insulin fluctuations were greater control and greater appetite in the study that we did as well. All energy-restricted diets produce similar weight loss. Just remember that when you're thinking of what diet do I do for weight loss, most diets that you find will actually achieve a similar weight loss outcome. But the novel low-carb and healthy fat diet plan between 50 to 70 grams did have a favourable therapeutic outcome for diabetics in our outcomes. How did I go for time? Yes.
26 seconds to spare. Thank you very much, Pennie. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our double act, Alphonse and Heleen, who will talk about the whole food plant-based approach. And we look forward to your presentation, and I'll start the clock running as soon as you begin.
No rush.
Thank you very much.
I would like to start with the following comment, and that is that we are two independent doctors. We have no conflict of interest, and up till now we managed to stay away from the banana, the bean, and the broccoli industry. Okay? Whole food plant-based. The power plate is a really good picture to explain this. 4 categories: fruit, vegetables, whole grains, and legumes. All the beans, lentils, and peas. Please eat it as whole as possible, as close to nature gives it to us. A limited amount of nuts and seeds, herb spices, and no or low added salt, oil, or sugar. Vitamin B12 needs to be supplemented. That's what we saw. Whole food plant-based nutrition is healthy. Says who? The Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics in the USA. I quote, "It's healthful and nutritionally adequate." This immediately puts to rest all these questions about deficiencies. Protein, iron, calcium. It's for all life stages. Keep quoting here. Pregnancy, lactation, infancy, the elderly people, athletes. It has health benefits for the prevention and treatment of certain diseases, and a reduced risk for heart disease, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, certain cancers, and obesity. And this position has been also being confirmed by many other professional bodies around the world, actually, including the Dietitians Association of Australia.
What we like to discuss to you is firstly coronary artery disease, secondly type 2 diabetes. We like to comment briefly on, may I call it, Pennie's diet, and then the convergence of everything, the conclusion. Coronary artery disease. Coronary artery disease is the #1 killer in Australia. About 20,000 people die every year, and it's the same all around the world. So it's a relevant clinical issue, I would think. I present to you now the study of Dean Ornish. This is a landmark trial which he published already in 1998. What Dean Ornish did, heart patients were offered 2 different diets and lifestyles. The first group, what we call the intervention group, they were offered whole food plant-based diet and some lifestyle modifications, including more exercise, stress management, moderate exercise, and group support. Mind you, the diet, the low-fat whole food plant-based diet, is by nature only 10% in fat. That's unique per point. The control group, they followed the advice of their cardiologist, modern medicine. Their diet, 25% of fat, and if need be, statins. As you know, those are cholesterol-lowering drugs. What were the outcomes? After 5 years, LDL cholesterol, the bad cholesterol, dropped in both groups about 20%. However, no statins in the plant-based group. 60% of the control group were given drugs already. Angina frequency, the crushing pain on your chest, which is life-threatening, clinically relevant. A drop of 72% with diet only, lifestyle changes only, and half of that in the control group. And in the meantime, apart from the drugs, 20% underwent an angioplasty, so a stent or balloon dilatation. And then the cardiac events per patient after 5 years for the plant-based group, less than 1 event, so could be an infarct, could be admitted to the hospital, etc. And in the control group, 2.25. So clinically relevant, significant differences. This is a great slide. It shows what happened to the coronary artery narrowing over time in this study. At the start, both groups had about 41% narrowing. That contributed to the pain, etc., and the symptoms. This is the group who followed advice of modern medicine. After 5 years, the clogging of the artery worsened, despite the stents, despite the drugs. And in the plant-based lifestyle group, the narrowings improved, and the difference after 5 years is highly significant.
I would like to take you to a study by Silberman, and he talks about 3,000 patients that were being treated in cardiac rehab situations according to the plan just explained by Alphonse, Dean Ornish's plan. And after 1 year looking at the results, they saw significant improvements for BMI, blood pressure, cholesterol, diabetes control, etc. Here we see Dr. Esselstyn. He showed reversal of heart disease with a whole food plant-based diet only. No intervention in the lifestyle, only the diet. 198 consecutive patients were followed for about 4 years. Of the 198, 177 were adherent. They could follow the plan, the diet. 21 were not capable of doing so. Symptom reduction, especially chest pain, 94%. In the people that couldn't adhere, 0. Reversal of the disease, so the narrowing becomes less, 22%. 0 in the control, and major cardiovascular event, 0.6% versus 62%, 10 times more in the people that didn't adhere to the diet. And here, one of the patients, a picture of a coronary artery, and you can see here how this has been narrowed by plaque. This artery is also known as the widowmaker, for a reason. And after 32 months, they did a repeat angiogram, and you can see that the plaque had gone, and restorage of the blood flow. Let's stop and pause for a moment. Our number one killer, we can stop and reverse with a plant-based diet. Should that not be the default diet until proven otherwise?
Type 2 diabetes, a debilitating disease which affects the quality of life for a lot of people around the world. It's a pandemic. It's spreading also in China and India now. Study, a randomized clinical trial by Dr. Bernard, whole food plant-based diet only, so no dietary restrictions, no increased exercise. They were offered whole food plant-based diet only. They, on average, had to increase their carbohydrate intake, the macronutrients, and no calorie restriction. The control group, they were given advice as per the American Diabetes Association, so the professional body who should know best. In general, they had to reduce their carbohydrate intake, and because most of them were overweight, calorie restriction was advised. So a customized diet for the patient. What happened? The result, after 5.5 months, medication reduction, 42% in the plant-based group and 26% in the control group. In the medication stable group, what were the results? Body weight change, here, HbA1c, so how well was diabetes controlled, and the reduction of bad cholesterol. All three improved, they did better on the plant-based diet only.
A study by Anderson, very interesting, reversal of diabetes in a metabolic ward. And that means that everything is highly controlled, what they eat and their movements. And special here was they were not allowed to lose weight, so that this would not influence the outcomes, because we know weight loss will make diabetes go better in itself. We are talking 20 men that were on insulin and they had a normal BMI. They were first on a standard diabetic diet, and then they were put onto a plant-based diet only. And that was very high in carbs. Thank you.
Don't swallow the microphone.
55% could stop the insulin only after 16 days. Moreover, cholesterol dropped to optimal levels. Again, should, for treatment of diabetes, a plant-based diet not be the first line of treatment?
Let's evaluate the diet as suggested by CSIRO. And what is good in general is, I would like to comment, great, it's hard to do randomized clinical trials over a year, 2 scientific publications, that deserves a big, we admire them for that. In general, we need to realize that the intervention by the CSIRO diet is threefold. 1, reducing the caloric intake by 30%. 2, dietary changes in the carbohydrate composition. And 3, exercise. So the results you see could be contributed by A, B, or C. Positive, you lower the intake of saturated fat to less than 10%. We would recommend less than 5%. You could argue, is that now nitty-gritty, just that 5%? In a big pooled research published in 2009 by Jacobson of more than 60,000 patients, that 5% drop in the consumption of saturated fat means they dropped, the risk that you would die from cardiovascular disease was dropped by 26%. So whilst you are moving in the right direction, there's still clinical benefit to be gained. No processed meat, we couldn't agree more. We know now from November 2015 publication that processed meat causes cancer, full stop. Attention for fiber, positive, thumbs up. However, your diet is still high in fat contents. You still use refined and processed foods such as oil. Calorie restriction and the combination of checking units and calculating energy expenditure, that makes it hard to maintain that diet. Our diet, you can eat as much as you like. You don't have to count calories. Then, last but not least, you still include animal products. And Heleen will continue on that topic.
I just would like to focus briefly on animal products. And, we're talking meat and the eggs, dairy, fish. I've listed here substances that are potentially detrimental to our health. For instance, intrinsic in animal food, so they are there, you can't just take them out. It's in the package deal. Or hazardous due to processing and cooking, carcinogenics are being produced. Contamination with bacteria and endotoxins that are very inflammatory. And biomagnification in animals of pollutants, heavy metals, herbicides and pesticides. And this all together is what we see from animal products is an increase in chronic inflammation, which is at the basis of chronic diseases. Looking at macronutrients and the high-carb diet and looking at plant-based nutrition, are they the same? Then just looking at the macronutrients, then we can see that carbs, fat and protein are far apart, not the same. Looking at micronutrients, plant-based nutrition, then here we have the kicker. These are health-promoting substances, the phytonutrients, more than 10,000. I listed a few and you will recognize a few. Antioxidants, anti-cancer, immune-stimulating properties. The antioxidants 64 times higher in plants than in animals. Fiber, 0 in animals, very high in plants. Again, there is a big gap in both diets.
Conversions of evidence. The summary. We discussed just 2 topics, heart disease and type 2 diabetes. We had to limit ourselves. The university was not very generous in our time allocation. Here are a lot of chronic diseases. You see the whole list there. They all affect the quality of life of many Australians. They shorten the lifespan. All these topics are chapters in the book by Dr. Michael Greger, How Not to Die. By the way, vegans will die. More than 2,500 references. This is, read the book. Conclusion, based on our evidence, evidence-based nutrition. There's nothing else you can do for your health that can match the benefits of plant-based nutrition. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I can just invite Pennie, and please join us in the front here. We have a time allocation for questions, and Lauren has a microphone, so if you have a question, please raise your hand, identify yourself, and keep the questions short and the responses short so we can get through as many questions as possible.
Thank you very much. You talked a lot about diabetes and other common killers, heart disease, but you've only touched upon briefly or not mentioned malignancy. Could you just touch upon malignancy? Cancer formation?
Yes.
Red
On a
meat,
plant-based
barbecued
diet?
sausages?
Are you asking me?
All of you three.
Oh,
It's a
okay.
panel question.
Yeah. Yeah, beautiful. A study also by Dean Ornish where he treated men with low-grade prostate cancer on the same program that he has. And that the prostate cancer could be reversed as well. And very special in that research, they also looked at epigenetics, so genes that code for promoting cancer. And of the 500 genes that were involved in promoting prostate cancer and also breast cancer, the majority was turned off already after 3 months on the diet. The majority was turned off. And yeah, these are very remarkable results.
Other questions? Oh, Pennie.
That's all right. I was going to say, with the like the low-carb diet, there's limited evidence around, or substantial evidence around cancer and low-carb diets per se, because the research funds don't go down that way. But you know, there are things that we are looking at to inhibit the oncogenesis process, so including resistant starch. So it's not about the total amount of fibre that you have in the diet that allows, or that you include in a low-carb diet, is the type of fibre. Making sure you get the right types of fibre, the resistant starch types of fibre that are found in a retrograded potato, for example, that's still included. Artichokes, Jerusalem artichokes that can have resistant starch, goes down into the lower bowel and produces a butyrate production, so that can be cancer prevention. So there are ways in any diet to actually incorporate these types of foods or fibres to actually mitigate that risk.
Thank you. So there's a question down the back, and then there's another one over there.
Can you speak to the difficulty of the adherence to the various diets and for your patients as an intervention, a primary intervention?
Oh, yes. I'll start that one. My background is a clinical research dietitian in delivering that trial that we did. And, you know, one of the things that we did navigate around is how compliant can somebody be to a 50-gram carb diet? And the exercise, what we tried to do is make it as life-intensive as we could, not as controlled. Because one of the key things we want to do is provide a dietary pattern that people can live to outside the clinical environment. So all these controlled studies, we wanted to make it more real world. You know, that was 2 weekly dietitian visits to help with compliance. So a lot of these studies that we've presented will have rigorous motivators intrinsically within that. So constant research contact, constant dietetic contact, constant motivation. So even in that process, we do see people non-compliant or non-adherent to dietary patterns. So, you know, one of the things that I still profoundly find really interesting is that halfway through, a lot of people were still, it wasn't so much about the energy restriction, it was around restriction of the types of carbohydrates they're having and the doses that they're having. So not restricting overall carbs, and that's where it became easier for them when we actually went to principles and not caloric restriction. And that's how we induced compliance.
Alphonse?
Comment about the adherence. If you look at the studies of Esselstyn, those patients were on cardiac death row almost because they were given up by the cardiologists, the cardiothoracic surgeons. So very motivated because they knew they had no choice almost. We are vegan, we became vegan 7 years ago, and because we knew the evidence. And to be honest, at home it's lovely, but if you go outside, there is a omnivorous world around us. In a restaurant, you have to negotiate with the cook. But the motivator number one, if type 2 diabetes patients, if cardiac patients find out after a few weeks they don't have the crushing chest pain anymore, they can drop their medication, that's the strongest motivator at all. The problem is, if you're healthy, the symptoms fly under the radar. So why would you go vegan? That's the challenge.
Question just...
This relates to vitamin B12, and I was wondering if you could recommend a suitable one, because I've read that it can be hard to absorb, sublingual or molecular. I was just wondering if you could recommend a particular one, please.
Thank you for the question. Vitamin B12, I think best way to take it is sublingual or a spray, so bypassing the stomach, basically. And then anything will do, basically. And listen, we are very good in retaining vitamin B12, so just a little is needed. And it is just not that the animals make it, it's made by bacteria in the soil. And in the days that we were still eating from the soil and we were drinking from streams, we would get that little bit of bacteria in our system. But we live now in a hygienic world for good reasons. We don't have cholera anymore, but animals still eat from the soil, so that makes the difference. But yeah, that's the only thing.
So just to put things into perspective, with Heleen and Alphonse becoming vegan 6 years ago, you can probably have enough stored B12 in your liver to last the rest of your life from being previous.
They say about 3-4 years at least.
Yeah, that's right. So, and the amount of B12 that you will need, an egg or milk, you don't have to necessarily eat meat, will actually last quite a while.
There's growing evidence that the microbiome in your gut has a lot to do with your chronic illness and so forth. I'd be interested in your comments around the role of fasting in a process where you eat both animal and vegetable, and you go through a period of feast and famine as our traditional forebears would in a hunter and gatherer model.
Okay, there we go. You're going down territory that probably isn't my expertise, but we have done a couple of trials, the 2 and 4, and the 2 fasting trials that come to mind are Faraday and Harvey. Faraday being in the US and Harvey an advocate in the UK. And they used animal-based proteins, background diets, and they did see a positive effect in fasting. As far as how that impacts on the microbiome, there's this hypothesis around gut rest and actually allowing time for that to increase. So I just can't go into that too much. Do you?
Yeah, it's such an important point. Thank you for putting this question here. The microbiome, the bacteria that live in our gut. It's an emerging science at the moment. We are at the start, basically. For instance, for chronic diseases, if you look at heart disease, if we have food components from meat and eggs, for instance, carnitine and choline, which we need, if that comes in the gut of a omnivore, then TMAO is being produced. If that comes into the gut of a vegan, it's not produced. Why is that significant? TMAO is a very aggressive atherogenic compound. It produces heart disease, probably as cholesterol does, or even worse, independent of cholesterol. So even if we try frenetically to bring that cholesterol down, if we are still consuming animal products, we are still being harmed, for instance, by TMAO. So, and that's all because of our microbiome.
This is for Heleen and Alphonse. One of my relatives has become vegan in her family, but she's a naturally tall and slim woman, and her husband is too. And they've lost a lot of weight, and we've got to the point where we're concerned about their weight loss because their BMI would be about 18 or thereabouts. Can you comment on the vegan diet for that?
Yeah, I'm glad to. Common complaint initially, because the food is very low in calories but very rich in nutrients, you have to eat big portions. So the satiety, by the way, of plant-based food is superior. The worst substance contributing to fat is actually giving negative satiety. But the recommendation is eat more carbs, and we'll be happy to give you personal advice, and even potatoes or sweet potatoes, because they are very healthy, but they need to improve their caloric intake. So it's the opposite of a lot of people. They want to do the opposite.
Yeah, so it's very important to have starch-based foods because they are very satiating and a little bit higher in the calorie density. So the problem, as Alphonse indicated, people usually don't eat enough, as in volume. Is that not good news? Eat more.
Can I? Frequency and dose.
Sorry, go right ahead.
Of carbohydrates and eating more starch. And we're looking at dose and types of starch here as well. And we know fibre can actually mitigate the spike of what starch does to insulin production. And insulin is also one of those stimulators of appetite, and this is where the low-carb diet was really quite successful. It actually controlled that insulin spike, therefore controlled appetite with protein and fats, but also with the adequate fibre from plant vegetables. Have you seen any studies that look into the dosing of carbohydrates in an unhealthy population, and what are they looking at? What proportion of carbohydrates per meal would they be looking at? Is there any literature around there?
It's just ad libitum. You just follow the power plate and you eat from that in equal, by visual portions and just to satiation.
Interesting comment. There is plant-based nutrition healthcare conference in the United States. It will be the number 4. You should see... 5, sorry. I missed 2. During lunch, you see all these plant-based people. Their plate is bigger than the pyramids in Egypt. That's why. So we don't have a small plate, big plates, and that's otherwise you will have hunger, and you don't want to have that all the time.
Could you comment on the diets in terms of acid and alkaline foods?
A high protein diet, lower carb indicates a higher protein diet as well, so around about 30%. So once you start consuming protein, you do actually start to get that acidity producing in the gut, and which helps cleave off iron and aid in iron absorption as well. Obviously, we do have in the lower carbohydrate diet the calcium, which actually can regulate the acidity as well. So we don't look at the acidity in the gut as such, and I don't know if there's any evidence around acidity and gut regulation, but in our diets, definitely protein is known to increase acidity, but not to detrimental levels.
It's a very alkaline diet, plant-based diet, so if you stick to the plan, it will be alkaline, full stop. No problems with acidity. Also people, for instance, having that acidity as in pH in your body, but also acidity as from reflux. People going on a whole food plant-based diet, they usually get rid of reflux and that kind of problems as well. So it's very soothing.
Other questions? Yes.
You presented some data in diabetic patients about how the plant-based diet improved those indicators. Thank you very much. And you pointed at the fact that the two groups were matched for an absence of weight loss, so there was no change in their weight to explain the effect that you saw. Given that diabetes is, by definition, a derangement of the metabolic processes, I'd say those results are probably difficult to generalise to the non-diabetic population, the healthy population. Are there any studies of the plant-based diet that have matched to other diets in terms of weight loss, or indeed an absence of weight loss, to show those same benefits in a way that you wouldn't be able to explain them by the effect of weight loss from the diet?
First of all, with the diabetes and what we are addressing, if you look at the basis of diabetes, it's actually not the glucose, that's the symptom of the disease. What is at the basis of diabetes is fat accumulation in the muscle cell, and that makes the insulin receptor insensitive, doesn't give off the signal to let the glucose into the cell. So that's what we have to address, and not address the symptoms. And all whole food plant-based studies, if they are compared, for instance, to the general public or whatever, weight loss is natural. We don't focus on weight loss. We focus on health. And weight loss will follow naturally. And you will end up on your natural weight. So you don't have to really look at weight anymore, because it will be your natural weight. And that will happen in a natural way and healthfully.
Do we still have time, Maria, or is
Well,
it time's up?
Time's just about up, so if Pennie wants to make a last comment to that question.
I was going to say, now I've just lost my mind. I was going to say, I guess with the vegan diet, what you're just describing there, by stealth, people actually are going naturally through caloric restriction without realising it, so it's compensatory, which introduces another variable in the outcomes is to answer that question as well. So, there's so many variables when you're looking at these studies that you can't really control for.
Yeah, it's not a restriction, I would.
Okay, so I think we'll cut it short there, and if you need any extra time, you can use it during your summing up. So thank you, everybody, for great questions, and thank you for taking all of those questions. You now have 3 minutes to sum up. Pennie, you can go first, and if there's anything extra you want to address from the questions, you might want to ad-lib. So off you go.
I guess my key point really, and I hope I've conveyed it quite well, is that there's not one diet that fits all. And I know that's a cliche term, but why is there so much nutrition confusion around what you should be consuming or what diet is better and what's healthier is because I'm not spruiking here, we don't have the research funds to actually do this, but really it is impractical to run long-term controlled trials with high compliance to find out safety and efficacy in these type of ways. Diet isn't the only contributing factor to overall health and wellness. It takes a lot of activity, a lot of thinking, stress, and B, interactions. We didn't even get down to stress in the gut reactions as well. Quite often, in my finding, being a dietitian, looking at the dietary patterns, quite often a lot of clinical trials also show that they're observational studies with imprecise dietary assessment. And so we do need a lot more randomised clinical trials to be grouped together so we can understand the impact of each diet for each individual. But again, it comes back down to we are diverse creatures. We can use selective use of the evidence to tell a story. But what you want to do is get the grouping of those lists of evidence to get the right story for you. So there are more points, what we've actually outlined today, and between the diets, and this is just a table to look at the low-carbohydrate, vegan diet, low-glycemic, Mediterranean diet, a range of diets, and look at the health benefits, and they all have good health benefits, good metabolic outcomes, good appetite, they can achieve weight loss. What we should be looking at is the commonality of interest. Is the commonality of interest, which really goes through what we're all saying is floating on the same line, is limited refined starches. We all say that. Reduce and eliminate added sugars, processed foods. Increase your vegetables. Australians are not eating enough greens and green leafy vegetables at all, so increasing those plant-based foods definitely goes without saying. And you can include, if it's your tolerance or your preference, lean meats, fish, poultry and seafoods. And it is quite consistent across all. When you're looking at what suits you, what is the healthiest, it's about individual responsiveness. Everybody has a different genetic makeup. Everybody has a different tumour necrosis factor release. Everybody has a different insulin release. Don't look for the best diet. Let's look for the diet which works best for you and get it back into perspective. And that's me.
Thanks very much, and 3 minutes.
Pennie, thank you for your contribution, and we would like to offer you symbolically 100% plant-based olive branch. All the best with completing your PhD. It's wonderful. And for Maria, thanks as well for being a professional moderator in moderation. And to both of you, Heleen and I are looking forward to cooperate and do some research together, because that's in the common interest of all. So CSIRO and SAMRI, we would love to have a cup of plant-based coffee or tea with you.
First, to all the people present here or listening to the recording later, you can optimize your health by moving away from the current belief that you need meat for protein and dairy for your bones.
As we clearly demonstrated today, you can reduce your risk of and treat many chronic illnesses by making the shift to a plant-based lifestyle. You don't need a doctor for that.
The rich Western diet is the root cause of most chronic diseases and a slow killer. The source of what you eat should be predominantly plants and not animals. Who would not want to make themselves heart attack proof?
You might wonder why most doctors don't inform their patients about nutrition or plant-based diet. Because doctors, most of us, are unwillingly unaware. Because it's not in the medical curriculum and therefore not yet in their toolbox.
In this misfortune, though, hides an opportunity for the University of Adelaide that is seeking the light and just might have found it. Now we have shed the light on how to stop and reverse major chronic diseases with plant-based nutrition, which is capable of primary prevention as well.
Alistair is chuckling, so that's very positive. It's our hope, therefore, that Alistair Bird, the Executive Dean of Health Sciences and Medicine, he is high up in the food in the pyramid. No, it's the power plate, sorry. Will take this golden opportunity to stand out, and I'm that serious now, and leave a legacy by turning things around and by being the first in Australia to include a course on preferably plant-based nutrition in the new medical doctor curriculum, which is now being designed.
That way, the doctors of the future will be able to effectively cure patients with chronic disease, something they always wanted to and sworn to do in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're perfectly on time, and I have the great pleasure of being able to summarise here. I think we've had an excellent discussion. Thank you to all of you for your questions. And I think what we've heard is that there are probably more similarities than differences in the healthful diets. What we actually often suffer from in westernised diets and westernised communities is that there's probably a few key things that we need to avoid doing, and I think came through implicitly in the conversations, but I think do need to be stated that, you know, one of the key things is that a calorie is a calorie. And it may come from different sources, and we do need to avoid overeating. And many different cultures have sayings whether, you know, you leave the table when you're 4/5 full is a common one in many Islamic and Asian cultures, and even some European cultures that say that you need to tie off the sack before it's overflowing. So I think the issue of not overeating is actually an important one. I think the other thing that's come out very strongly is to avoid eating the highly processed foods. And that is where there are a lot of calories that aren't particularly nutrient dense. And another thing is that many of these foods often don't rot. You know, there was a question about the microbiome, and I think that's actually a really important thing to remember, that, you know, the microbiology that goes with natural foods is actually part of the important health benefits. Eating a wide variety of foods from many different sources will actually ensure that you are meeting all of your nutrient requirements, and as did come out is that we do eat foods, not nutrients. So it's actually, we need practical information and advice about what that really means. Very strongly was the message, and is enforced by our Australian Dietary Guidelines, the plant-based approach, and also the other healthful approaches, whether it be the Mediterranean diet or the low-carb or whatever, is that we are choosing foods that are mainly vegetables, fruits and whole grains, nuts, seeds. And that is the basis of a healthy diet. The point of contention today has been about animal foods. And really, you know, there are different ways to achieve things. Different cultures do things differently. And it is important to not overdo the animal foods, and a modest intake can be healthy. The issue of vitamin B12 was raised, and that is, you know, B12 is an essential vitamin, and we as dietitians often believe that we should be getting all of our nutrition from food, not supplements, and the only place we can get B12 in our current society is from a very small quantity of animal foods. That doesn't need to be meat. It can be milk, it can be cheese, it can be egg. So on that note, I will summarise and finish, and really the take-home message, which we've already seen once before from Michael Pollan all the way back in 2007, still holds true: to eat real food, not too much, and mostly plants. So thank you very much.
Thank you for a wonderful summary there. Just make a few points. The first is, as a fairly recent convert to cauliflower rice, I feel I've got a foot in both camps. It sounds like I can eat as much cauliflower rice as I want. What I haven't decided is whether this evening it will be with a vegetable curry or a chicken curry. Secondly, I will pick up the point that we will look we are revising some of the curriculum for the medical program here, and I think we do need to include in that refreshed program a little bit more in terms of healthy diets and how the influence of that on healthy living. As always, we will do that in a very balanced and evidence way, and we will incorporate many of the things that we've heard about tonight. And thirdly, I would just hope that you all agree that this has been a very informative, indeed an exciting event. I think, to me, it's probably the first of several debates of this sort, because it is a different format. I think it is an exciting way to do it, particularly on topics such as this. So finally, can I just thank all of the contributors this evening. First of all, Pennie, many thanks for your contributions. Thank you very much. To Alphonse and Helena, thank you very much. And finally, Maria, for keeping us all on track and seeing fair play. And then finally, also thanks to Lauren and the team for wonderful organisational skills. So that concludes this evening's event. Thank you all for coming. We hope to see you again at future events. Thank you.